promised a few videos ago that I would do a wrap-up of slimish volumes of theology. Some of you are interested in it. I know it is a somewhat specialised subject, but in this day and age, theological literacy is extremely important. If you think about the great debates between what has now become the polarising forces of our world, of science and faith, it is in fact an artificial polarisation. It's actually only really been around the last 20 odd years, up until the advent of new atheism. Actually science and faith could speak to each other without the kind of rancour that it does now, and suspicion, which is correct. The late Stephen Jay Gould called science and religion the two great magisterium, rather than one supplanting the other. They answer different questions, and arguably, or not that arguably, the new atheists stem from 9/11, a sense of religious fundamentalism from Islam suddenly becoming a real threat, and our secular society having to answer it. Obviously, religious fundamentalism is a threat, but it doesn't necessarily follow that science has to take a position where it is only amenable to the hatred and opposition of religion, which is the case in some of the new atheists. Anyway, that's kind of beside the point. I just wanted to run through books essentially that have really made a kind of difference to me. Now, I'm not going to go to primary texts, because essentially if we're talking about Western monotheism, those primary texts essentially are the Old and New Testament and the Quran, with various points. Augustine being one, Thomas Aquinas being the next, maybe Luther being the next, and Ignatius of Loyola the next, and then we're into Descartes and theology and philosophy meeting and then splitting apart again. So first things first. This is the longest book, and it's actually just called The History of God by Karen Armstrong. I read this 30 years ago. It's what it is. It is a primer, really, about the three great monotheisms, but without being in any way intellectually patronising. It has real rigour. She's actually in fact an ex-nun, but she's a really wonderful writer, and it has a really intellectual rigour, but does get through the stuff pretty swiftly, and is highly recommended by the head of the Jewish community, at that point head of the Christian community, but also atheists. So it's a very very good place to start if one needs rooting in some of the kind of original detail. I'm going to get to my three favourite towards the end. This is very good. It's called A Short History of Atheism by Gavin Heyman, published by IB Tauris. The reason I'm putting this as theology is actually he's writing as a theist, but he's essentially looking at how theism and atheism became a kind of cultural phenomenon over the last 300 years. And I think it's important because theology now, these days, is not just about the argument for God. It is about the argument about God. And that is a fascinating place to start. A book that I missed endless tube stops because I just was reading it, thoroughly engrossed. It's Keith Ward, The Evidence for God, The Case for the Existence of the Spiritual Dimension. It's published by Darton, Longman and Todd. It's very short. He's actually Regius Professor of Divinity Emeritus at Oxford, and a really, really good writer. And essentially, he's dealing with something that a lot of theists talk about: is that science thinks they have ownership over evidence, but actually, theists base faith on evidence. It's just a different optic in terms of what evidence means. And Francis Spufford is very interesting on this. But I'll maybe talk about that at another point. And so it's important to understand that the world, evidence is not just owned by science. Theism has a way through this. If you're interested in, this is John Robinson's Honest to God. This was a text that was written in the 1960s and essentially blew apart how the Anglican Communion at least thought about God. And it's, as I say, very short but very influential. This I really... No, actually, I'll move to this. That's my top three. A Brief History of the Soul by Stuart Gertz and Charles Taliaferro, Wiley Blackwell, the publisher. Once again, a short book, which is looking at the notion of what's called technically ensoulment, the idea that we are possessors of souls, non-material and that sort of non-material property. And this kind of connects with theories of mind. Now, at the moment, the most fashionable theories of mind are very materialist, the computational theory of mind, etc. That somehow we are just 10 billion neurons that are essentially inanimate objects. Somehow, without a step change in kind to produce mind or soul, create personhood. I find that difficult to believe, and this is a book that deals with that. A very important piece of work, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a part of the Protestant resistance to Nazi in Germany. He was eventually imprisoned and executed days before liberation of Paris. And these are incredibly poignant, thoughtful, considered, rigorous examination of his situation and where God is in terms of of what was happening to Europe at that time. So it's a profound account of a great spiritual intellectual when put under terrible stress and imprisonment, and it's a work of great human generosity and honesty. This is really, I love this, but I really found this brilliant. The Disappearance of God, A Divine Mystery by Richard Elliott Friedman. He's a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, San Diego, and has doctor degrees, a doctor of theology at Harvard, and has been a visiting scholar at Oxford and Cambridge. And what it is, it's very interesting. It's just this kind of story about how you have a lot of God at the beginning of Scripture, and he slowly pulls himself out, forgive the male pronoun, out of the picture as man becomes more reliant on themselves to manage the world. And it's, it is palpably true. If you start at the beginning of Scripture and you go to the end of the Old Testament, especially, God is barely present. There are almost no miracles. but once again, I think it's a very important way of looking at the relationship between God and man, and essentially not smuggling God in to man's work and making him responsible, which is in a way something that new atheists do. They dislike religion, and they kind of smuggle God in as well. Whereas religion is the structures and creation of man. God is his own creation, if you will. And this is an interesting angle to look at that in terms of actual God's place in Scripture, and that he is maybe the originating creative force, and then pulls away, and we are left alone. And in fact, in Bonhoeffer's terms, I think we have to now be grown-ups, and that might mean living without God, but having a sense of what God would want us to have been in a kind of parent-child way, which is, anyway, that's a very interesting way of just looking at something else. This is brilliant. The Problem of Evil by Peter van Inwagen, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame in the US, a Catholic, and so the problem of evil is theodicy, the idea of how, the argument that there's so much evil in the world, how can God exist? And this is an extraordinary, very kind of slick but brilliantly argued proof of God coming from the problem from evil. Theodicy, can't turn that into a longer word. And it's essentially saying, okay, if you were going to use the legal proofs of doubt, can we argue the existence of God through that? And at times it's difficult, knotty, but always illuminating, and at some points more exciting than most pieces of theology, and it's really worth reading. And finally, I'm going for a very thin and beat up book by the great 20th century Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, The Shaking of the Foundations, which are essentially a number of sermons he made during the 1940s, maybe into the 1950s. But more than that, I think the central sermon in here, and for me, the central meaning or central expression of the meaning of God, is in a sermon he gave called "You Are Accepted." And I feel that anybody who wants to have the most kind of human understanding of why someone might feel themselves drawn to God, and what it means to have a sense of grace. And for me, You Are Accepted is in its 10 pages is the equivalent of any religious message or spiritual message or God-directed message I have ever read. And I offer that to you. If one was to read anything that I've said, I've shown you, that sermon, and it is a central sermon by Paul Tillich, would be the one I recommend. Thank you.